Lee Oswald, after working more than a year at Two Jacks, told his supervisor, Frank DiBenedetto, in September 1956 that he was quitting in order to join the Marine Corps. Lee Oswald's mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, quit her job at Gold Rings in New Orleans on July 31st, 1956. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Robert Oswald drove from Fort Worth to New Orleans, picked up his mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, and his brother, Lee Oswald, and drove them back to Fort Worth. Lee Oswald and his mother arrived in Fort Worth in September 1956. Marguerite rented apartment number 3 at 3830 West 6th, where she lived for the next 2 years. Lee McCracken, who lived in apartment number 2, remembered Lee Oswald and told the FBI that Lee visited his mother on 2 occasions when on leave from the Marines. Mr. McCracken said that Lee Oswald stayed in the apartment with his mother about 2 weeks each time. Lee Oswald gave his mother's address of 3830 West 6th to the Marine Corps and to the Red Cross. The Fort Worth Retail Credit Merchants Association reported Marguerite Clavery Oswald living at 3830 West 6th in 1957, as did the Fort Worth City Directory. While Marguerite Clavery Oswald was living at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth in 1956 and 1957, the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald Imposter was living 2 miles away at 4936 Collinwood. Harvey Oswald lived at this address until he joined the Marines in October 1956. Robert Oswald lived at this address until he married Veda Mercer in November 1956. 1 week before Harvey Oswald visited the Marine Corps recruiting office in Dallas on October 15th, Robert Oswald wrote a check to Harvey Oswald. Robert wrote his phone number and his home address as 4936 Collinwood on the check. When the Marguerite Oswald Imposter testified before the Warren Commission in 1964, she was asked when she and her son moved from New Orleans to Fort Worth. This imposter had no idea when Marguerite Clavery Oswald and Lee Oswald moved to Fort Worth. But there was one person listening to their testimony who did know the answer, and that person was former CIA Director Allen Dulles. Dulles, a member of the Warren Commission, spoke up and said, quote, "I think you moved to Fort Worth with Lee in September 1956. The short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald Imposter had been living at 4936 Collinwood in Fort Worth with Robert Oswald and Harvey Oswald since July 1st, 1956. 2 months later, on September 6th, Harvey Oswald enrolled as a sophomore in Arlington Heights High School. Richard Garrett, who had known and befriended Lee Oswald at Ridgely West Elementary in Fort Worth, was with him at Arlington Heights High School in September 1956, just before Harvey Oswald joined the Marine Corps. On February 21st, 1964, Richard Garrett told Life magazine about meeting up with Oswald. Garrett said, quote, "He walked up to me in the hall at school. I remember I had to look down on him to talk. And it seemed strange because he had been the tallest, the most dominant member of our group in grammar school. He looked like he was just lost. He was very different from the way I remember him in grammar school." Richard Garrett knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald in grammar school, but met the short, thin Harvey Oswald in high school. 3 weeks later, on September 28, 1956, Harvey Oswald dropped out of Arlington Heights. On October 3rd, Harvey Oswald wrote a letter to the Socialist Party of America and asked if there was a branch in the area he could join. On October 15th, in preparation for his enlistment in the Marine Corps, HARVEY Oswald was interviewed. His eye color was listed as hazel, his hair color was listed as brown, his weight as 135 pounds, and his height at 5 foot 8 inches. 3 days later, on October 18th, HARVEY Oswald turned 17, and the Marguerite Oswald Imposter signed a parental consent form that allowed him to enlist in the Marine Corps. According to the consent declaration, Oswald's age was verified by his birth certificate. On October 24th, HARVEY Oswald signed the Marine Corps enlistment contract before recruiting officer Captain R.K. Jones in Dallas. His enlistment term was for 3 years, and he was assigned service number 1653230. Item 20 on the enlistment contract states, quote, I request the following commercial insurance company policy to be notified in case of my death in active service. Now, the reader may remember that Marguerite Clavery Oswald's, Lee Oswald's mother, purchased a life insurance policy on Lee Oswald's life in the amount of $1,000 in 1945. But HARVEY Oswald did not know that a life insurance policy existed for Lee Oswald, and therefore he wrote none in the space provided for the name of the commercial insurance company beneficiary. 2 years later, in June 1958, the National Accident and Life Insurance Company notified Marguerite Clavery Oswald that the life insurance policy for Lee Oswald had been canceled for non-payment of premiums. At the Marine Corps recruiting station in Dallas, HARVEY Oswald filled out and signed a report of medical history. On this form, someone wrote, quote, mastoid operation 1945, but listed no scars. Lee Oswald had a long scar on his left neck from a mastoidectomy performed at the Harris County Hospital in Fort Worth on February 8, 1946, not 45. But HARVEY Oswald had no such scar. Another report, titled Report of Medical Examination, also listed a mastoid operation in 1945. But Lee Oswald's mastoidectomy was in 1946. On this report, item number 39 was listed as OPS 3 left mastoid, end quote, indicating a 3-inch scar on the left side of Lee Oswald's neck. But HARVEY Oswald had no such 3-inch scar, and this report was unsigned and could have been prepared by anyone at any time before being given to the Warren Commission. HARVEY Oswald's height was again listed at 5 foot 8 and 135 pounds. Very different from the husky 5 foot 11-inch Lee Oswald, who was remembered by Frank DiBenedetto only 2 months earlier when Lee Oswald was working at Two Jacks in New Orleans. Marine recruits are fingerprinted and photographed on the day of their enlistment. HARVEY Oswald's enlistment contract and record was prepared in Dallas on October 24, 1956, and his photograph was affixed to the document that was published in the Warren volumes as Folsom Exhibit Number 1. After HARVEY Oswald's medical report and examination were completed, he and 3 other recruits, George Scott, Donald Elam, and Donald Davis, were given $6 in cash for taxi fare and airline tickets to San Diego, California. At 4:00 p.m., the 4 recruits left by taxi for the airport. They boarded American Airlines flight number 207 at 6:45. and arrived in San Diego at 11:45 p.m. that evening. These young men were together at the Marine Corps recruiting station in Dallas. They were together on the flight to San Diego. They were together in boot camp, and their photographs appear in the Marine Corps Platoon 2060 yearbook. We know that it was Harvey and not Lee Oswald who enlisted in the Marine Corps in Dallas on October 24th, 1956. On the same day, October 24th, a Lee Harvey Oswald applied for and was accepted into the Marine Corps at the Marine Corps recruiting station in Fort Worth, Texas. The original typewritten name on this enlistment form was Harvey Lee Oswald. But the typewritten name of Harvey Lee Oswald was erased and typed over with the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Harvey Oswald and the 3 Marines from Dallas reported for duty at the Marine Corps recruit station in San Diego, California. They were assigned to the 2nd Recruit Training Battalion. The name Lee H. Oswald first appears in the Marine Corps unit diaries at boot camp. This is Harvey Oswald, who was with the same people who traveled with him from Dallas to San Diego: Donald Davis, Donald Elam, and please Scott. Another recruit, Alexander D. Feld, known as Allen Felde, was also listed on the same unit diary and would spend the next 10 months with Harvey Oswald. After the assassination, Feld was the only Marine interviewed by the FBI who served with Harvey Oswald at boot camp, at ITR training, in Jacksonville, Florida, and at the Aviation Electronics School in Memphis, Tennessee. Feld's statement about Harvey Oswald is significant because they conflict with the location of Lee Oswald at the same time. Harvey Oswald's height was recorded again at 5'8", 135 pounds, with no physical defects. On October 30th, Harvey Oswald took a series of aptitude tests. His composite general classification was scored 105, which was 2 points below the Marine Corps average. His preference of duty was recorded as aircraft maintenance and repair, the duty for which he was recommended. On December 13th, 1956, Harvey Oswald was given a test with a pistol. On December 17th, he was given a test with a Browning automatic rifle. On December 21st, he was given a test with an M1 rifle and scored 212, which qualified him as a sharpshooter. On January 6, 1957, Harvey Oswald, Platoon 2060, was diagnosed with tonsillitis, given an injection of penicillin, and advised not to swim. Now, Harvey Oswald had tonsillitis, but Lee Oswald could not possibly have tonsillitis. In January 1945, 6-year-old Lee Oswald was living with his family at 4801 Victor in Dallas. On January 17th, 1945, Lee Oswald's tonsils were surgically removed by Dr. Philbin at Parkland Hospital. On January 20th, 1957, after boot camp ended, Harvey Oswald and 7 Marines from Platoon 2060 were transferred to Camp Pendleton for infantry training. Those 8 Marines were Harvey Oswald, Allen Felde, Herbert Cooley, Gerald Crowley, Keith Marr, Carl Solway, Peter Schiffo, and Robert Smith, recorded in the Marine Corps Unit Diary, page 925, numbers 16 through 57. These Marines were assigned to Company A, 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry Training Regiment. This 8-man squad shared a tent at Camp Pendleton and spent a lot of time together. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, FBI Director Hoover obtained an original copy of Lee Harvey Oswald's 1956 federal income tax return on December 16th. Now this is Commission Exhibit 90A. This 1956 return was allegedly filled out by Oswald, was signed and mailed to the IRS on February 7th, 1957. The next day, February 8th, this return was allegedly received by the District Director of the Internal Revenue Office in Fort Worth. It's difficult to believe this return was mailed from Camp Pendleton, California on February 7th and received at the Internal Revenue Service in Fort Worth only one day later. Now, the FBI gave photographs of this 1956 tax return to the Warren Commission. Gross wages and withholding taxes were listed on the return from 3 companies: J.R. Michaels, Jared F. Tujak, and the Pfisterer Dental Lab. The information listed on this return is identical with the income listed on the FBI's fabricated W-2 forms for each of these companies. At first glance, there appears to be no reason to question either the single-page tax return or the W-2 forms. However, we previously learned that the W-2 forms for these 3 companies were typed with the same typewriter, fabricated by the FBI, and photographic copies were returned to the Dallas police as evidence on November 26, 1963. Question: how likely is it that a 16-year-old teenager would keep 1956 W-2 forms from 3 different companies in his possession for 8 years? The most obvious reason this 1956 tax return was fabricated was the entry of $612 income from the Pfisterer Dental Lab. Lee Oswald's original income tax return, 1956, would show income from Tujak's, J.R. Michaels, and from the Marine Corps. No income from the Pfisterer Dental Lab. It was Harvey Oswald who worked at Pfisterer in 1956. Harvey worked at Pfisterer in 1957 and 58, while at the same time, Lee Oswald was in Japan. Now, this was a serious problem that could never be made public. The FBI tried to resolve this problem by shifting the date of Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfister's from 1957 and 1958 to the year 1956. This was an attempt by the FBI to show that Oswald worked at Pfisterer in 1956 instead of working at Pfisterer for 8 months in 1957 and 1958, while Lee Oswald was in Japan. Another reason to question the authenticity of this 1956 tax return was the entry of $80 for income received from the J.R. Michaels. There is no documentation whatsoever to prove that Oswald was ever employed by J.R. Michaels. The only known check given to Oswald from J.R. Michaels was for $34.20 without any supporting documentation, and this check was given to the FBI. Still, another reason to question the authenticity of this tax return was the failure of Lee Oswald to list his 1956 income from the Marine Corps. It's difficult to believe that Lee Oswald who had been in the Marines for the past 4.5 months, forgot to include his 1956 Marine Corps income on his tax return. The reason that Oswald's Marine Corps income was not included on this 1956 tax return is very simple. When the FBI received this tax return from the IRS in December 1963, the FBI was unable to verify Oswald's income from the Marine Corps. The FBI did not show any of Oswald's Marine Corps on this fabricated 1956 tax return because that information was not available. The FBI gave photographic copies of this fabricated 1956 tax return to the Warren Commission. The FBI then gave the Warren Commission a photographic copy of Oswald's tax return for 1958 that was completely unreadable, except for the signature and the date on the return. The FBI also gave no information about Oswald's tax return for 1957 and 1959 to the Warren Commission. Now, the reason that Oswald's 1956 tax return did not include income from the Marine Corps, like I said, was simple. Because Oswald's income from the Marine Corps was unknown until September 15, 1964, when the Marine Corps provided certified military pay records to the Warren Commission. This is why there was no military income recorded on the FBI's fabricated 1956 return. They didn't know about the income. They didn't know the amount of the income. This is also why Oswald's 1958 tax return was unreadable, and why the FBI gave no information to the Warren Commission about Oswald's 1957 and 1959 tax returns. Because in 1957, it would also have had income from the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory when Oswald's in Japan. Lee Oswald's in Japan. Soon after the assassination, this fabricated tax return was given to the Warren Commission to show that Oswald worked at Pfisterer in 1956, rather than in 1957-58, as reported by Palmer McBride, William Wulf, and numerous members of the Astronomy Association in New Orleans. When the Department of the Navy released Oswald's certified payroll records on September 15, 1964, Oswald's military income was reported for 1956 as $174.20. Now, also according to the 1956 tax return, Oswald should have received a refund check in the amount of $64.20. But the FBI made no attempt whatsoever to obtain a copy of the refund check, nor is there any indication that either Oswald or Marguerite received or cashed such a check. Now, readers need to understand that a refund check of $64.70 represented most of the federal income tax that was withheld by Michaels, Tujaks, and Pfisterer. But if Oswald never worked at Pfisterer in 1956, there was no tax withholding money ever given to the IRS, and a refund check of $64.10 could not have been issued. The truth is that Oswald never received a refund check for $64.10 because one was never issued. The purpose of fabricating the W-2 forms and fabricating Oswald's 1956 tax return was simply to create the illusion that Oswald worked at Pfisterer in 1956 instead of working at Pfisterer in 1957 and 58 when Lee Oswald was in Japan. On February 27, 1957 now, the tall, husky Lee Oswald took leave and visited his tall, nice-looking mother at 3830 West 6th, Apartment 3 in Fort Worth. Robert Oswald's wife, Veda, told the FBI, quote, "About 4 or 5 months after their marriage, Lee Oswald was on leave from the Marine Corps and visited them on one occasion," end quote. Robert Oswald told FBI agent Charles Brown that he saw his brother only one time during his Marine Corps service, at which time Lee Oswald came home on furlough to Fort Worth. Lee McCracken, Marguerite's neighbor in apartment number 2, told the FBI, quote, "Lee Oswald came home on leave from the Marines on 1 or 2 occasions and stayed around the house for about 2 weeks on each trip." Mr. McCracken remembered that in early 1957, Marguerite was employed at the Clyde Campbell Men's Store in Fort Worth. McCracken's memory was confirmed by the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Association, whose records show that Marguerite C. Oswald was working for Clyde Campbell Men's Store in March, April, and May, and living at 3830 West 6th. At the same time, during the first half of 1957, the short, heavyset Marguerite Oswald Imposter was unemployed and living alone at 4936 Collinwood. After Lee Oswald's leave ended, he began attending Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville, Florida on March 25, 1957. While Lee Oswald was attending school in Jacksonville, Harvey Oswald and Allen Felde were living in a tent at Camp Pendleton, California, with 6 other Marines. On February 26, 1957, the 8 Marines who completed boot camp and ITR training at Camp Pendleton were listed on roster number 3 of Marine Corps Unit Diary 22-57. They were Herbert Cooley, Gerald Crowley, Keith Mark Colsaway, Peter Skiffo, and Robert Smith. Now, Allen Felde and Harvey Oswald. After boot camp, there is no indication that either Harvey Oswald or Allen Felde left Camp Pendleton. Feld told the FBI that he and Harvey Oswald remained at Camp Pendleton and shared a tent with these 6 Marines until May of 1957. May of 1957. According to Harvey Oswald's neighbors at 4936 Collinwood, they never saw young Harvey Oswald again. And after he joined the Marines in October of 1956, even though the Marguerite Oswald Imposter resided at 4936 Collinwood until July 1st, 1957, they never saw Harvey Oswald. Now, after Lee Oswald's military leave ended, he left his mother's apartment in Fort Worth. On March 18th, 1957, Lee Oswald reported for duty at the Naval Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, Florida. From March 18 through May 3rd, 1957, Lee Oswald attended Class P in Aviation Fundamentals. The same day, on May 3rd, 6 of the 8 Marines from Camp Pendleton reported for duty at the Naval Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, Florida. On April 23rd, 23-year-old Robert Oswald and his wife Veda purchased a small 2-bedroom house at 7313 Davenport in Fort Worth. John Pick was in the Air Force and stationed at Mitchell Air Force Base in Hempstead, New York, while his wife and 2 children were residing in an apartment in Long Island. The Marine Corps unit diaries that listed the name Lee Harvey Oswald were withheld from the public until 1997. Why? Because these diaries are very useful in confirming the dates and locations of Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald's Marine Corps assignments. However, researchers should understand that these diaries show the dates of both Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald's military assignments at various locations. In March and April 1957, Lee Oswald was attending class in the Aviation Fundamental School at Jacksonville, Florida. At the same time, Harvey Oswald and Allen Felde were at Camp Pendleton in California until the end of April 1957. The FBI report of Allen Felde was published in the Warren volumes, but Feld never testified before the Warren Commission. After the assassination, FBI agent Robert Schoenecker interviewed Allen Felde and reported, quote, Oswald impressed Feld as being left-winged and continually discussed politics and wrote to United States senators, particularly Senator Thurman. Oswald condemned people of wealth and championed the cause of the working man, end quote. Schoenecker's report was given to the Warren Commission and published as CE 1962, Volume 23, page 797. The Warren Commission, however, ignored Feld's statement and offered no explanation as to how Lee Oswald could have attended a class in Aviation Fundamental School at the Naval Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, while at the same time, a duplicate Lee Oswald was in infantry training at Camp Pendleton, California. The FBI and the Warren Commission were now following a similar pattern of ignoring troublesome witnesses by ignoring Allen Felde and failing to question any of the 6 Marines who shared a tent with Allen Felde and Harvey Oswald at Camp Pendleton from January through April 1957, when Lee, at the same time, was attending Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville, Florida. The Warren Commission simply ignored the evidence that placed Harvey Oswald in Pendleton from January through April 1957. The Warren Commission instead focused on the Marine Corps records that placed Lee Oswald at Jacksonville in March and April 1957 and totally ignored Allen Felde. On May 3rd, 1957, after attending Aviation Fundamentals class for 6 weeks, Lee Oswald graduated 46th in a class of 54 students. Lee Oswald was given a military occupation specialty code of 6700 for aviation and was promoted to private first class. Lee Oswald was awarded a certificate from the Department of the Navy showing that he had completed Aviation Fundamental School. Other Marines who attended the Naval Technical Training Center were Thomas Cooley, Owen Dejanovich, Daniel Powers, Buddy Simcoe, Martin Wold, and Nelson Delgado. Allen Felde told FBI agent Schoenecker that in May 1957, he and Harvey Oswald left Camp Pendleton. They were transferred to the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida, where they attended A&P class, Airframe and Power Plant, during May and June 1957. May and June is important. After completing A&P class, Allen Felde was promoted to private first class. The following day, Feld's assignment at Jacksonville, Florida, was extended for 6 weeks until July 22nd, 1957. Marine Corps Unit Diary 104-57 and 102-528 confirmed that Felde and Oswald were at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida on May 2nd, 1957. This entry in the Marine Corps Unit roster agrees with the statement Felde gave to Agent Schoenecker. These records help to establish where Harvey and his Marine Corps assignments with Allen Felde were. Now, after Harvey was arrested on November 22nd in 1963, the Dallas police found a 7-page handwritten account of his background among his possessions. Harvey Oswald wrote that he served in San Diego, California from October 56 to April of 1957, and at Camp Pendleton in California in April and May 1957. Again, Allen Felde and Harvey Oswald were attending A&P classes in May and June, while Lee Oswald was attending radar school in May and June in Biloxi, Mississippi. After graduating from the Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville, Marine Daniel Patrick Powers was chosen to supervise a small group of 6 fellow Marines. On the evening of May 3rd, Powers, together with Lee Oswald, Edward Bandoni, James Brereton, Donald Camerata, and Martin Schrand, boarded a train for Biloxi, Mississippi. Marine Corps Unit Diary 10557, page 722, confirms these 6 Marines were transferred from Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville to the 3,380th Technical Training Group and the 3383 Student Squadron at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi. Now, several hours after Harvey Oswald and Allen Felde arrived at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Lee Oswald and his small group left Jacksonville by train for Biloxi, Mississippi. Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi was known as the 3380 Technical Training Center. Master Sergeant James King was an instructor supervisor on the A shift, the course for aircraft control and warning operators. In 1957, hundreds of Marines took this course, and all were assigned to the A shift, which was held from 6 a.m. to noon, Monday through Friday. The course lasted 6 weeks and included 180 hours of instruction on radar familiarization, radar indicators, air surveillance operations, direction center operations, and electronic countermeasures. Now, in 1998, researcher William Weston interviewed former Marine Sherman Cooley. Now, what he said is very important. Cooley told Weston that he, Nelson Delgado, Ronald Cobb, Jack Germany, and Daniel Powers were in Platoon 1060, while Peter Camerata was in Platoon 1070. Now, Cooley remembered that Lee Oswald was in, now this is Lee Oswald, not Harvey, Lee was in Platoon 1069 or 1070. At the same time, Harvey Oswald was in Platoon 2060. His photograph's in the yearbook. Lee Oswald in Platoon 1069 or 1070, and Harvey in Platoon 2060. That's important. Now, Cooley explained that Marines from the 1000 platoon series attended radar school a week or two before the Marines in the 2000 platoon series. We know that Harvey Oswald was in Platoon 2060, and we now know that Lee Oswald was in Platoon 1069 or 1070, the 1000 series platoons. Lee Oswald, Powers, Camerata, Brereton, Bandoni, and Schrand were members of the 1000 series of platoons, while Harvey Oswald and Allen Felde were in Platoon 2060, the 2000 series of platoons. Now, Lee Oswald arrived in Biloxi, Mississippi on May 4th, 1957. Lee Oswald's first day of radar school was on May 6th, with Powers, Camerata, Bandoni, Brereton, Charand from the 1000 platoon series. This group of 6 Marines attended class along with 23 members of the Air Force. These 6 Marines bunked together, often went on liberty together. Powers remembered that Bandoni, Brereton, and Camerata were quite close, but that Lee Oswald was usually alone. Powers said, quote, "He used to go home to New Orleans from Biloxi, 117 miles. He went to New Orleans on the weekends because it seems that he wasn't ever around here," end quote. But in May of 1957, Lee Oswald's home was not in New Orleans. Lee Oswald's tall, nice-looking mother lived at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. But Lee Oswald could have visited his Aunt Lillian and cousins in New Orleans. While at Keesler Air Force Base, Daniel Patrick Powers was promoted to corporal, and he remembered that during this time, Lee Oswald acquired the name Ozzie. On June 18th, an Air Force Certificate of Proficiency as Aircraft Control and Warning Operator was issued to Lee Harvey Oswald. This document was allegedly found by the Dallas police in Oswald's rooming house at 1026 North Beckley following the assassination. However, this document was not found by the Dallas police at Harvey Oswald's rooming house, because this document was not initialed, not dated, and not included on the list of inventoried items found at North Beckley by the police. This document, awarded to Lee Oswald, was somehow given to the FBI, was then included among the 230 additional items of so-called evidence that the FBI returned to the Dallas police on November 26, 1963. The 6 Marines from Jacksonville, together with 23 Air Force personnel, graduated from the radar school in Biloxi on June 18, 1957. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, only one of these Marines, Daniel Powers, was questioned by the FBI and Warren Commission. Peter Camerata provided an affidavit to the Warren Commission. Camerata said that during the time he knew Lee Oswald, quote, he had no recollection of any remarks concerning communism, Russia, or Cuba, end quote. Bandoni and Brereton were not questioned by either the FBI or by the Warren Commission. Martin Schrand died from gunshot wounds on January 5th, 1958, while on duty from the Marines. After graduating from radar school in Biloxi, the 6 Marines were given 3 weeks leave. They received orders to report to the 4th Replacement Battalion at the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro, California, on or before July 12th. Powers remembered that for Lee Oswald's leave, quote, he mentioned Texas and his mother, end quote. According to the Fort Worth Red Cross records, Lee Oswald's tall, nice-looking mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, had been residing at 3830 West 6th since October 1956. On May 29, 1957, and again on June 19, 1957, the Fort Worth Retail Merchant Association reported her address as 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. Marguerite's neighbor, Lee McCracken, remembered Lee Oswald's visit and again told the FBI, quote, he stayed around the house for about 2 weeks on each trip, end quote. McCracken said that Oswald had no friends and stayed in the apartment most of the time and read books. After his leave, Lee Oswald reported for duty at El Toro, California on July 9th, 1957. While Marguerite HARVEY Oswald was living at 3830 West 6th. The short, heavyset Margaret Oswald Imposter was living at 4936 Collinwood. Mrs. Lois Taylor, the manager of 4936 Collinwood, told the FBI that Marguerite Oswald lived in her 4-unit apartment building from July 1st, 1956 to July 1st, 1957, 1 year. Mrs. Taylor remembered when Marguerite Oswald moved out because Marguerite still owed $6.60 for past due utility bills. Mrs. Oswald's next move was to 1031 West 5th in Fort Worth, where Mrs. Taylor contacted her on 2 or 3 occasions and attempted to get her to pay overdue utility bills. Mrs. Oswald refused to pay, and Mrs. Taylor never saw her again. Because this imposter moved to New Orleans, where she and HARVEY Oswald resided in the upscale Hotel Senator beginning in September 1957. Now back to Lee Oswald. On July 9th, 1957, Lee Oswald reported for duty at El Toro, California, and was giving a medical dental evaluation in preparation for overseas duty. On his medical report, Lee Oswald gave the address of his mother as 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. The following day, July 10, Lee Oswald was issued an immunization certificate and once again gave his mother's address as 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. Lee Oswald then gave this same address to the Red Cross for emergency purposes. Daniel Powers checked in on July 12th, 1957, but did not see or remember Lee Oswald at El Toro. Powers said, quote, "I have no memory of the individual at all," end quote. Powers remained at El Toro until August 21st, when he traveled by bus to the San Diego harbor and boarded the USS Bexar for Japan. There were hundreds of Marines who reported for duty at the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro in July and August. Owen Djanovich checked in on July 19th. Roscoe White checked in on July 26th from Camp Pendleton. Oswald was then transferred to the Naval Technical Training Center in Millington, Tennessee. This is HARVEY. HARVEY and Feld were assigned to a Marine detachment and received classroom instruction in aviation electronics. Feld explained that his assignment to FBI agent Schoenecker, and Schoenecker reported, quote, "In approximately July 1957, they, Feld and HARVEY Oswald, were both sent to Aviation Electronics School in Memphis, Tennessee," end quote. Feld also told Schoenecker that during the time he knew HARVEY Oswald, that Oswald continually wrote to United States senators, one of whom was Strom Thurmond. HARVEY Oswald found fault with President Eisenhower and voiced his opinion against U.S. participation in the Korean War. Oswald also condemned Eisenhower's poor tactics in the utilization of a tank unit at the same time of the invasion of Europe. Feld told Special Agent Schoenecker that he considered HARVEY Oswald very left-winged. 2 months later, at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in New Orleans, co-worker Palmer McBride expressed a nearly identical opinion about HARVEY Oswald when they began working together in October 1957. By the end of July 1957, Allen Felde and HARVEY Oswald had been together for 10 months through boot camp at San Diego from October through January 1957, infantry training from January through April 1957 at Camp Pendleton. Feld in A&P class in Jacksonville from May 2nd through July 22nd, 1957, and the Naval Air Station in Memphis, Tennessee through August 1957. Feld's statement that he was with HARVEY Oswald in boot camp in California in 1956 until September 1957 is unknown to nearly every JFK researcher and conflicts with all known Warren Commission, FBI, and Marine Corps records, except in a few cases the Marine Corps unit diaries. Allen Feld's 11-month close association and friendship with HARVEY Oswald, and in particular their assignment in Millington, Tennessee, was undoubtedly the reason that Feld was never allowed to testify before the Warren Commission. Once again, neither the FBI nor the Warren Commission made any attempt to resolve Allen Feld's conflicting statements. However, either the FBI or the Warren Commission could have interviewed dozens of Marines who knew HARVEY Oswald and were pictured in the Platoon 2060 yearbook. They could have interviewed Marines who were with Feld and HARVEY Oswald in boot camp, or the 6 Marines with whom Feld and HARVEY Oswald shared a tent during infantry training in Camp Pendleton during the spring of 1957. They could have requested records for Allen Feld and HARVEY Oswald from the A&P class at the Naval Air Facility in Jacksonville, Florida, and records from the Aviation Electronics class at the Naval Air Station in Millington, Tennessee. Feld told the FBI the last time he saw HARVEY Oswald was in September 1957, when Feld was transferred to Opelika, Florida. In the mid-1950s, the Opelika Airport, specifically Building 67, was the site of a large CIA operation run by operatives including E. Howard Hunt, Ted Shackley, David Morales. This base sponsored the U.S.-led coup in Guatemala in 1954 and was a precursor to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. This site also served as a listening post during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The FBI and the Warren Commission knew that HARVEY Oswald and Allen Feld were assigned to the Naval Air Facility in Millington, Tennessee, because the FBI interview of Allen Feld was published in the Warren volumes. The reason for avoiding the Naval Air Facility in Tennessee was simple. From August 12, 1957 to September 12, 1957, Lee Oswald was in El Toro, California, or he was aboard the USS Bexar en route to Japan, while at the same time, HARVEY Oswald and Allen Feld were at the naval station in Tennessee. When we look at the locations of Allen Feld and HARVEY Oswald from October 1956 through September 1957, we soon realize there was no time for HARVEY Oswald to have attended radar school. Now, this is a serious issue because in 1959, when HARVEY Oswald was stationed at Santa Ana, California, he worked as a radar operator every day. The obvious question is, where and when did HARVEY Oswald attend radar school? We first look at Daniel Powers' Marine Corps orders that he read during his testimony before the Warren Commission. Powers brought his original Marine Corps orders with him during his testimony, and Powers read, quote, "Effective 3 May 1957, the below listed Marines are directed to report to the 3380 Technical Training Group, 3383 Student Squadron, Block 21, Building 17, Shipping and Receiving Section, Keesler Air Force Base, Biloxi, Mississippi, for duty under instruction. Operators course number AB 27037, class 08057, for a period of about 6 weeks, end quote. These orders for the 6-man group came directly from Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. However, Daniel Powers' Marine Corps orders were different from those given to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission printed Oswald's Marine Corps orders in the Warren volumes. But the Warren Commission documents show a different student squadron number, a different course number, and a different class number. Powers' Marine Corps orders show that Lee Oswald was assigned to the 3383 Student Squadron, while the Warren Commission records show the student squadron as 3381. Powers' Marine Corps orders show the course number was AB 27330, while the Warren Commission shows course number AB 27037. Powers' Marine Corps orders show class number 08057, while the Warren Commission shows class number 24047. These contradictions became obvious when Powers read his Marine Corps orders during his testimony before the Warren Commission. The Air Force soon provided the Warren Commission with a form identified as 1TAF Form 20 that shows the number of the student squadron, the course number, and the class number were all changed from what appears on Powers' Marine Corps orders as to what was published by the Warren Commission. Oswald's Marine Corps records, as published in the Warren volumes, appear to be for Lee Oswald, who graduated from radar school on June 18, 1957. The unanswered question is, why did Powers' Marine Corps orders differ from those given to the Warren Commission? We next look at an FBI report that shows a class for course 27330 at Biloxi Radar School that convened on April 24, 1957. And an FBI teletype which states that Lee Harvey Oswald graduated from radar school on May 27, 1957, with 4 other Marines. But we know that Lee Oswald graduated from the radar school on June 19, 1957. Could Harvey have attended a radar school on April 24th and graduated on May 27th? Then we look at the Naval Air Facility in Millington, Tennessee, where Allen Felde and Harvey Oswald were assigned from mid-July through early September 1957. In 1957, this Naval Air Facility had a radar school. Could Harvey Oswald have attended a radar class at this facility? Finally, we have Marine Owen D. Janovich, who told the FBI that he first met Oswald in a 6-week radar school in Biloxi, Mississippi during May and June 1957. Now, there's one issue. Unit Diary number 66-57, page 981, shows that Dejanovich arrived in Biloxi on Sunday, May the 12th, 1957. And he began attending radar school the following day on May 13th, which is 1 week after Lee Oswald began attending radar school on May the 6th. We should remember that Marine Sherman Cooley said that Lee Oswald was in either Platoon 1069 or 1070, which is the platoon all of the other 5 members were in Platoon 1000 series at the radar school where Lee Oswald attended. Now, Cooley said that the Series 1000 platoons and the Series 2000 platoons alternated classes on a weekly schedule. We know Lee Oswald in the 1000 series platoon began radar school on May 6th. The following week, Dejanovich in the 2000 series platoon attended radar school a week later on May 13th, 1957. 14 months later, in October 1958, Dejanovich was briefly with HARVEY Oswald in Iwakuni, Japan. 3 months later, in January 1959, Dejanovich was stationed at the Marine Corps base in Santa Ana. Dejanovich and HARVEY Oswald worked together at the radar facility in Santa Ana, California for several months. It seems like HARVEY Oswald may have attended radar school in Biloxi with Dejanovich 1 week after Lee Oswald began attending radar school. Now, when Allen Felde and HARVEY Oswald were attending Aviation Electronics School in Millington, Tennessee in August, preparations were underway to ship a Marine detachment to Japan. On August 22, 1957, Lee Oswald left El Toro, California, for the harbor in San Diego, where he boarded the USS Bexar. Daniel Patrick Powers, who got to know Lee at radar school in Biloxi, spent a lot of time with Lee Oswald aboard ship. Powers recalled that Lee Oswald taught him how to play chess, which they often played for 3 or 4 hours, and remembered that he read many books, including The Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment. Lee Oswald was an avid book reader as described by Julian Evans in 1954, Ed Vogel in 1955, and Daniel Powers in 1957. Gator Daniels was another Marine who met and spent time with Lee Oswald aboard the USS Bexar while en route to Japan. Daniels became friendly with Lee Oswald and taught him how to play nickel and dime poker. A week into the voyage, the USS Bexar stopped in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the Marines were given leave. Lee Oswald did some sightseeing and used his Minox camera to take a photograph of the King Kamehameha statue in front of the State Office Building in Honolulu. On August 31st, 1957, Lee Oswald mailed a postcard to his tall, nice-looking mother at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth that read, quote, "Well, only one day here, but I have been having a lot of fun. 12 more days at sea to Japan. Love, Lee." End quote. Fellow Marines remembered that Lee Oswald wrote to his mother continuously. Yet this postcard sent from Hawaii is the only surviving piece of correspondence written by Lee Oswald to his mother. The last time Allen Felde saw HARVEY Oswald was in Millington, Tennessee, in September 1957. FBI agent Schoenecker reported, quote, "During September 1957, he was transferred to the Marine Corps Air Station at Opelika, Florida, and did not see HARVEY Oswald again after this date." End quote. At the same time, Lee Oswald was aboard the USS Bexar and arrived in Japan on September 12th. The Warren Commission took the time to interview Marines who had known Lee Oswald only for a few days while in Japan. but did not interview Allen Felde and other Marines who knew Oswald very well. Now, Allen Felde was with Harvey Oswald nearly every day, January 1957 through August 1957. The Warren Commission never obtained any records relating to Harvey Oswald from the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Millington, Tennessee. Why not? Because the FBI and Warren Commission continued their pattern of ignoring witnesses whose statements conflicted with their official story of one Lee Harvey Oswald. We shall soon see that the FBI and the Warren Commission also ignored another person who was with Harvey Oswald every day for 8 months in New Orleans in 1957 and 1958, while Lee Oswald was in Japan. On September 12, 1957, Lee Oswald arrived in Atsugi, Japan, while Harvey Oswald was in the United States. For the next year, Lee Oswald would be in East Asia with Marines who knew him from radar school, knew him aboard the USS Bexar while sailing to Japan, and knew him at Atsugi. Now, Lee Oswald, 15 months later, in December 1958, was assigned to the Marine Air Base in El Toro, California, where he would keep a low profile until he was discharged 3 months later in March 1959. This is Lee Oswald. Following the assassination, there would be no FBI investigation, no FBI reports, and no Marine Corps investigation of Lee Oswald at El Toro. All attention was focused on Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald at the Leiden Air Facility in Santa Ana, California. Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald would be remembered by most of his fellow Marines for endlessly promoting communism, Castro, and Cuba. 11 months later, in October 1959, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, who had assumed the identity of Lee Oswald, would defect to the Soviet Union. After leaving the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Memphis, there are indications that Harvey Oswald may have traveled to Yellow Springs, Ohio. 1 week after the assassination, on November 29, 1963, Sergeant Donald Schwartz of the Intelligence Unit of the Columbus, Ohio Police Department received information that Harvey Oswald attended classes at Antioch College for a short period of time. Sergeant Schwartz said, quote, "He was dismissed because he was unable to prove his graduation from high school," end quote. The FBI once again failed to conduct a thorough investigation into Harvey Oswald's reported attendance at Antioch College by interviewing faculty members and students, because it would have conflicted with Lee Oswald in Japan. Ruth Payne, who played a significant part in Harvey Oswald's life in 1963, graduated from Antioch College 2 years earlier in 1955, and she also had a brother who lived in Yellow Springs. After the assassination, FBI agents John Weinberg and William Betts interviewed people who knew Ruth Payne when she attended summer sessions at the University of Pennsylvania in 1957. An FBI informant, PHT1, advised that Ruth had studied and was a member of the Young Friends movement. She studied Russian. This group, located in Philadelphia, was interested in relaxing East-West tensions. The FBI informant said that it was through the Young Friends movement that Ruth Paine had first got in contact with Lee Harvey Oswald, through pen pal activity. One Commission Attorney, Albert Jenner, briefly touched on the subject of pen pal activity with Ruth Paine. Jenner said, quote, "And out of this interest and activity arose the Russian pen pal activity and the bringing of some Russian students over to America to see and observe America," end quote. When Ruth Paine answered yes, Jenner responded, quote, "I won't go into that," end quote. Jenner and the Warren Commission refused to explore the possibility that Ruth Paine's first contact with Harvey Oswald may have been in the 1950s, possibly in 1956, when 16-year-old Harvey Oswald was living at 4936 Collinwood in Fort Worth before he joined the Marines, or maybe in 1957 at the Antioch College in Yellow Springs. Sergeant Schwartz passed the information about Harvey Oswald's possible attendance at Antioch College to FBI agent Robert Mahler. If Harvey Oswald was in Yellow Springs for a few weeks in the fall of 1957, he soon left and moved to New Orleans. In the fall of 1957, probably September, the short, dumpy, heavyset Marguerite Oswald Imposter moved from 1031 West 5th Street in Fort Worth to the French Quarter in New Orleans. For the next 10 months, she and Harvey Oswald lived in a small second-floor apartment at the upscale Hotel Senator on Dauphine Street. Harvey Oswald, after leaving the Aviation Electronics School in Millington, Tennessee, with Allen Felde, left the Marines and joined his caretaker mother at the Hotel Senator. 17-year-old Harvey Oswald soon obtained a job at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory, directly across the street from the hotel, where he met and befriended 18-year-old Palmer McBride. On September 12, 1957, Lee Oswald and fellow Marines arrived at Yokosuka, Japan. This is Lee Oswald. After leaving ship, they boarded a bus for the 30-mile trip to Atsugi and reported to Max 1, Mag 2, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, a unit consisting of 117 Marines in a very large jet field, Jet Air Force Base. From the original group of 6 Marines who attended radar school with Lee Oswald in Biloxi, 2 Marines, Brereton and Camerata, had no contact with Oswald in Japan. Daniel Patrick Powers and Martin Schrand had limited contact with Lee Oswald. Powers was an athlete who spent most of his time playing football and rarely saw Oswald. Powers said, quote, "He was not athletic," end quote. Schrand may have spent time with Lee Oswald, but he died from a gunshot wound in January 1958 while on guard duty in the Philippines. A few of the Marines who met Lee Oswald aboard the USS Bexar, including Gator Daniels and John Rene Heindel, remained friendly with Lee Oswald after they arrived in Japan. Daniels often borrowed money from Oswald, while Heindel recalled that Lee Oswald generally went on liberty by himself. Heindel said Lee Oswald never seemed to be interested in politics or international affairs. He knew of no nicknames for Lee Oswald. In Japan, Lee Oswald was assigned to a bunk on the first level of Barracks Number 5, a large 2-story wood frame building in Atsugi. The structure was near the East Gate of the base and housed 72 Marines. The war lockers, where men stored their belongings, were arranged to provide cubicles for sleeping quarters. The cubicle to which Lee Oswald was assigned contained 3 double-bed bunks. Sharing the cubicle with Lee Oswald were Zach Stout, Robert Ogg, Ronald Crawley, and Thomas Bagshaw. Now, I met and became friends with Zach Stout, who lived in El Dorado, Kansas, and we had numerous conversations about Oswald. Zach remembered the day Oswald arrived and said, quote, "I arrived in August 1957, and Oswald arrived a month later. He was one of 3 or 4 who just came into the barracks one day dragging their sea bags," end quote. Zach became one of Lee Oswald's closest friends in Japan and worked with him almost every day for 10 months. But Zach was never interviewed by the FBI or by the Warren Commission. Lee Oswald slept on the upper bunk of a double bunk which he shared with Robert Ogg. Ogg told the Warren Commission that Oswald's sack, locker, and footlocker were always in good order and located alongside his. A photograph was taken of Lee Oswald standing in front of his locker. Ogg described Lee Oswald as a regular guy who was inclined to be quiet, neat, and clean. Ogg worked with Lee Oswald on the same radar crew and remembered that he usually went on liberty alone. Ogg was not interviewed by the Warren Commission. Ronald Crawley and Thomas Bagshaw were the other 2 Marines who shared a cubicle with Lee Oswald in Atsugi in late 1957. Neither Crawley nor Bagshaw were interviewed by the FBI or by the Warren Commission. Neither the FBI nor the Warren Commission dared to interview any of the Marines who bunked with the tall, husky Lee Oswald in Japan, because Lee Oswald was much taller and much heavier than the short, thin man who was accused of assassinating President Kennedy. Marines who spent the most time with Lee Oswald in Japan were not interviewed. Years later, Zach Stout was interviewed by the HSCA and said that he, Zach, hung around with a group of Marines in Japan that included himself, George Arthur Wilkins, Bobby Warren, and Lee Oswald. These young men were together nearly every day for 10 months, either in Japan, aboard ship, in the Philippines, Subic Bay, or even on Liberty. Now, Zach Stout's group spent most of their liberty in the towns of Yamato and Sagami, which were near the base in Atsugi. Sagami was near the main camp, while Yamato was near the east camp and a 20-minute bus ride. While on liberty, they often encountered fellow Marines at local bars. Zach recalled that Lee Oswald always seemed to be with the same Japanese girl, as was the custom of many of the Marines. Liberty ended at midnight, which limited their free time and activities to nearby towns. Zach said that Lee Oswald's best friend at Atsugi was George Arthur Wilkins. The 2 young men spent a lot of time together and took many photographs, a few of which are in the National Archives. I spoke with George Wilkins on one occasion. He lived in Brooklyn, New York, and was confined to a bed. And I did not see him. I just talked to him very shortly, very briefly on the telephone. One of the photographs taken by George Wilkins is of Lee Oswald with a military background in the background, military barracks in the background. Another photograph, probably taken by Lee Oswald, is of George Wilkins with the same military barracks in the background. On the back side of the photo of Wilkins, Lee Oswald wrote in pencil, quote, "My friend, George Hans Wilkins," end quote. This photo appeared in the February 21st, 1964 edition of Life magazine in the lower right-hand corner of page 74A. This photo was designated CE 287 by the Warren Commission, but there's no indication, this is interesting, there's no indication how or where Life magazine acquired this photo or many other photos published in this issue. These photographs were taken by Lee Oswald, not Harvey. The unexplained appearance of these photographs in Life magazine is significant because these photographs were never found by the Dallas police among Harvey Oswald's possession at his rooming house, nor at Ruth Payne's house. But on November 23rd, 1963, the FBI had custody of all of the 225 items confiscated at Oswald's rooming house and the Payne house by the Dallas police. These items were sent to Washington, D.C. FBI headquarters, and 3 days later, the FBI returned not 225 items, but the FBI returned 455 items to the Dallas police. An extra 235 items. And I believe these photos from Life magazine were among the extra 230 items returned to the Dallas police by the FBI. The photographs of George Wilkins and Lee Oswald are black and white. They're about the same size as a 35 millimeter photograph, except they are noticeably wider. By comparing the length and width of these photographs with photographs taken with a Minox camera, I was able to determine that both were taken with a Minox. During the time Lee Oswald was in the Far East, he apparently acquired a Minox 3 camera. The Minox, sometimes called a spy camera, was developed by Walter Zapp, who first manufactured this camera in Latvia in 1937. A Model 2 was manufactured during World War II with serial numbers beginning 31500. A Model 3 was produced from 1951 to 1953 with serial numbers beginning at 31275 through 58499. A Model 3S was produced from 1954 to 1958 with serial numbers 58500 to 140766. I have owned a Minox camera for many years, and this small camera is very easy to use. At the National Archives, I held Lee Oswald's camera in my hands. To operate this camera, you slide open either side of the camera to expose the camera lens. When open, the serial number of the camera can be seen. But the camera I held in the National Archives could not be opened. It was filled with a heavy material that prevented the camera from being opened, probably, to hide the serial number. A Minox miniature camera became famous in the James Bond spy movies of the early 1960s. This camera is less than a quarter of the size of a package of cigarettes, yet is a precision instrument which is capable of photographing documents at close range or distant laboratories. The Minox uses a special film contained in a very small plastic cartridge. Minox film can only be processed in the United States at the Minox Laboratory in New Jersey. The Minox produces a finished photograph that is the same height but a little wider than a developed photograph produced by a 35 millimeter camera. The length of a Minox photo distinguishes it from similar sized photographs. The National Archives has several Minox photographs of scenes in Japan, Philippines, Atsugi, Hawaii, and of Lee Oswald and his Marine buddy George Wilkins. The only Minox photographs in the JFK collection in the National Archives are those taken in the Far East. Another question that I have is, where did Lee Oswald get the Minox film developed? I mean, they're only developed in New Jersey. So maybe Oswald waited till after he got back. I don't know. Most of the Marines who worked with Lee Oswald nearly every day for 10 months in Japan and the Philippines, like Zach Stout, George Wilkins, Bobby Warren, Jerry Pitts, Edward Bandoni, James Brereton, Ronald Ogg, or Richard Bullock, were never interviewed by the Warren Commission. These men were not interviewed because Lee Oswald, who was stationed in the Far East with these Marines, was much taller and huskier than the short, thin Harvey Oswald accused of assassinating President Kennedy. In July 2003, JFK researcher Bill Kelly met and interviewed a former Marine named Richard A. Bullock, who knew Oswald in Japan. Mr. Bullock knew Lee Oswald as Ozzy and said he was 30 to 40 pounds heavier and 3 to 4 inches taller than the man accused of killing President Kennedy. Bullock said the Oswald he knew in Japan was not the man accused of killing President Kennedy. I personally spoke with Bullock several times by telephone. Each time, Bullock was adamant that the person he knew as Lee Oswald in Japan was not the person accused of killing President Kennedy. On one occasion, I sent Mr. Bullock an 8x10 color photograph of several Marines with fatigues. Mr. Bullock identified all but one of those Marines and returned the photograph to me. Certain FBI officials knew that Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald were physically different. They were concerned that if either FBI agents or the Warren Commission thoroughly questioned Marines who knew Lee Oswald in the Far East, their statements might suggest there were two different people using the name Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marine Corps. The FBI's well-established pattern of ignoring witnesses who knew and worked with Lee Oswald in the Far East becomes even more clear when we understand the FBI focused virtually all of their attention on witnesses who worked with Harvey Oswald at the radar facility in Santa Ana, California. In fact, Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, FBI Director Hoover, wrote a memo to his agents that read, quote, "Although the names of former Marines, associates who might have known Oswald have been received, the Bureau does not believe it desirable or necessary to interview all of these men." End quote. So the FBI's interviews of Marines who knew Lee Oswald in Japan were discontinued. No more interviews. Among the dozens of Marines who knew Lee Oswald en route to Japan, knew him in Atsugi, knew him in the Philippines, knew him in Corregidor, Subic Bay, in 1957 and 58, the FBI interviewed the following Marines. Now, these Marines, not surprisingly, barely knew Lee Oswald, as evidenced by their statements to the FBI. I will read you their names. I won't read what they said. It's just, they all say basically the same thing. They didn't know him very well. Robert Ogg, William K. Trail, Peter Cassisi, Richard Sear, Sidney S. Robinson, Robert Demers, Peter Francis Connor, Peter Jerry Ellis Pitts was one Marine who remembered Oswald's dislike of the nickname Harv, H-A-R-V. Pitts said that Oswald, quote, bitterly resented anyone calling him by his middle name of Harvey, or the shortened name Harv, and he wanted to fight anyone who persisted in calling him by either of those names. Pitt told the FBI, quote, he had very little personal contact with Oswald, end quote. These Marines knew Lee Oswald only slightly. Once again, we see interviews with Marines in Japan who had little contact with Lee Oswald. Zach Stout, Bobby Warren, George Wilkins, who were very close to Lee Oswald, spent 10 months together with him. Philippines, Japan, Corregidor, they were never interviewed. The radar bubble in Atsugi, Japan, was operated 24 hours a day by 4 radar crews, each crew working 6 hours on and 12 hours off. Only one of the Marines who shared a cubicle with Lee Oswald, Robert Ogg, worked with him on the 10-man radar crew. Zach Stout, who I spoke with many times, said, quote, Ogg worked with Ozzy all the time, end quote. Paul Edward Murphy told the FBI, quote, he got to know Lee Oswald casually as a military acquaintance, but did not know him very well personally, end quote. He knew Lee Oswald at Max 1 for 2 or 3 months and said that Lee Oswald kept to himself, had no friends or associates, and usually went on liberty by himself. In 1958, Murphy was placed in the brig in Atsugi for 90 days, while some of the Marines from Max 1 were sent to Japan. Harvey Oswald seldom drank alcohol and was referred to many people as a teetotaler, but not Lee Oswald. Jerry Pitts recalled one night when Lee Oswald was passed out drunk in a parking lot next to the barracks. Peter Cassisi remembered that Lee Oswald returned from leave on several occasions completely drunk. John Rene Heindel remembered that while in Japan, Lee Oswald drank a great deal, often becoming intoxicated. The Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald in Japan said he never spoke about communism, was not interested in politics, and never spoke or studied a foreign language. Lee Oswald kept to himself, read a great deal, drank a great deal, and occasionally engaged in fights with fellow Marines, but not Harvey. The short, thin Harvey Oswald was never known to have been involved in a fistfight. He continuously discussed communism as he had done in North Dakota, in Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth, with Allen Felde, with Palmer McBride, and with Marines at Santa Ana, California in 1959. Harvey Oswald occasionally drank, was never drunk, and spoke Russian fluently when at Max 9 in Santa Ana. With the launching of Sputnik on October 4, 1957, the space race between the Russians and the United States began. In New Orleans, this event stunned members of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association and was a date that will be etched in their minds as long as they live. William Eugene Wulf was president of the Astronomy Association, and his close friend Palmer McBride had been a member for 2 years. Wulf and McBride attended different schools, but got to know each other and became close friends through the Astronomy Association. The association consisted of a dozen teenagers from New Orleans and surrounding areas who shared a common interest in astronomy. All members were either junior high or high school and included Wulf, McBride, Joe Eustace, William Searcy, Ralph Hartwell, Walter Gerke, Paul Fogg, James Vance, and Cammie Smith. Meetings of the association were held on the second and the fourth Saturdays of each month at 7:30 p.m. And at the Cunningham Observatory in 1955 and in 1956, they were held at De La Salle High School when Wulf was a sophomore. In the fall of 1956, Wulf became seriously ill, dropped out of De La Salle, and missed the remainder of his junior year during the 1956-57 school year. The following year, in the fall of 1957, Wulf re-entered his junior year at Cohasset High School in New Orleans and resumed his association with the Astronomy Club. The Pfisterer Dental Laboratory was across the street from the upscale Hotel Senator, where 17-year-old HARVEY Oswald and the heavyset Marguerite Oswald Imposter were living in late September 1957. Founded by Louis Pfisterer and John Auditor, in 1906, the dental lab grew into a full-service dental laboratory. In February 1944, the Pfisterer Auditor Dental Laboratory registered as a commercial partnership with managing partner Phil Pfisterer, George Cannell, Harry Levesque, William Butler, George Bishop, and Frank Cadle. Each partner operated a different section of the laboratory, and each partner had 1/6 ownership. During the 1950s, the dental laboratory was located on the second floor of 227 Dauphine Street in the French Quarter, across the street from the Hotel Senator. The lab produced various items for New Orleans area dentists, including crowns, bridges, false teeth. The finished products were given to the office manager, Mr. Williamson, or to his assistant, Imelda Smith, who arranged for delivery. The deliveries were assigned to one of the 4 and sometimes 5 delivery boys who work for the lab. 18-year-old Palmer McBride was one of the delivery boys who had been working at Pfister's for the past 2 years. Palmer continued working at Pfister until mid-August 1958. Other delivery boys included 18-year-old Lionel Slater, a native of New Orleans who began work at Pfister's in 1955, 28-year-old John Ulmer, a native of New Orleans, and 18-year-old Paul Fiorello. I spoke with Paul Fiorello on several occasions. Paul was raised at Hape Hoven, an orphanage in Marrero, Louisiana, which was run by the Catholic Charities. In the fall of 1955, Paul was released to his uncle, John Fiorello, and lived with him on Bourbon Street in the French Quarter. Paul attended school for a while, worked briefly at Winn-Dixie and Maison Blanche, and then began work for Pfister's as a delivery boy from the spring of 1956 through 1966. Paul told me that HARVEY Oswald began work at Pfister's, and I quote him, about a year to a year and a half after I started working at Pfister, in the summer or fall of 1957. From HARVEY Oswald's first day of school at first day of work at Pfister in October 1957, 18-year-old Palmer McBride and 17-year-old HARVEY Oswald got along well. They quickly became friends, and soon McBride invited HARVEY Oswald to his home to listen to classical music on 2 or 3 occasions. McBride liked to visit the Opera House, where his father worked part-time. Palmer remembered that on one occasion, he and HARVEY Oswald attended the opera Boris Godunov. During the 1950s, Boris Godunov played only twice in New Orleans. Once on October 10th, 1957, and the second time on October 12th, 1957. At Pfisterer, office worker Imelda Smith remembered that Harvey Oswald and McBride often discussed and argued about the merits of communism. On one occasion, McBride and Harvey Oswald discussed recent Russian space successes and the possibility of war. The first Russian space success was the October 4th, 1957 launching of Sputnik. The second Russian space success occurred on November 3rd, 1957, when a second rocket was launched that carried a live dog named Laika into space. During one of their conversations, Harvey Oswald pointed to the Russians' successful space launches as proof of the superiority of the communist system. McBride responded by saying that he felt the United States should place more emphasis on our space program. Harvey Oswald then made the statement, in a serious frame of mind, that he would like to kill President Eisenhower. This was the second time Harvey Oswald made remarks about killing a president. The first time Harvey Oswald made this statement was to William Timmer in Stanley, North Dakota in 1953. It is important to understand that both McBride and Timmer told the FBI that Harvey Oswald made threats against a president and spoke about communism. But neither man was interviewed by the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission could have used their testimony to corroborate Harvey Oswald's antipathy toward a U.S. president and Oswald's support of communism. However, in doing so, Timmer would have testified that he knew Harvey Oswald in North Dakota in the summer of 1953, while Lee Oswald was still living in New York and preparing to enter the 8th grade at Public School 44 in the Bronx, fall semester 1953. Palmer McBride would testify that he knew Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, when Lee Oswald was in Japan. Their testimony would have contradicted the Warren Commission's version of Oswald's life and risked exposing the two Oswalds. As we shall see, these men were only two of the many witnesses ignored by the Warren Commission, because their testimony would have placed Oswald in a location that contradicted the Warren Commission's official version of Oswald's life. McBride said that Harvey Oswald lived directly across the street from the dental lab on the second floor of the Hotel Senator. Harvey Oswald went home each day during lunch. In the French Quarter, where the streets are narrow, the Hotel Senator was less than 30 feet from the stairs to the dental lab. On one occasion, Harvey Oswald took McBride to his apartment and showed him Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, books in which McBride had no interest. 2 years later, Harvey Oswald defected to Russia. He told UPI reporter Eileen Mosby, "We moved to North Dakota, and I discovered one book in the library, Das Kapital. It was what I'd been looking for." Harvey Oswald introduced McBride to his mother, who soon left and told the boy she was going to the grocery store. McBride described Oswald's mother as short, heavy-set, gray-haired, and not very friendly. End quote. While Harvey Oswald was living at the Hotel Senator from October 1957 through May of 1958, Lee Oswald was in Japan, and his mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, was still living at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. It is worth pointing out that employees of the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory were among the first people interviewed by the FBI, even though Harvey Oswald was only 17 years old when he began working at Pfisterer. On Saturday, November 23rd, FBI agents arrived at Pfisterer. They interviewed Imelda Smith, Harry Levesque, Eugene Earle. The next day, on Sunday, FBI agents interviewed George Cannell, Johnny Lopez, and Lionel Slater. On Monday, FBI agents interviewed Paul Fiorello, Warren Meyer, John Kazow, and George Bischoff. The FBI took any and all employee records relating to Harvey Oswald, and those records soon disappeared. It's important for people to realize only one day after President Kennedy was assassinated, the FBI was focusing their attention on collecting school and employment records for a teenage Lee Harvey Oswald. A teenager. FBI agents began collecting junior high school records in New York City for 13-year-old Oswald. Junior high school records from Beauregard Junior High in New Orleans for 14-year-old Oswald. Stripling Junior High School records from Fort Worth for 14-year-old Oswald. Employment records from Two Jacks for 15-year-old Oswald. And employment records from Pfister for 17-year-old Oswald. So, what we have here is the FBI making a concerted effort to collect documents early on for a teenage Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, FBI agent John Malone, in charge of the FBI's office in New York City, visited with Judge Florence Kelly in New York City in order to obtain Oswald's 7th and 8th grade junior high school records. Each and every one of the school records, the original school records from New York City and from Beauregard, are gone. They disappeared. The only thing that remains of these school records are photographs, FBI photographs, that are now in the National Archives. And every one of these, the original records, documented the life of Harvey Oswald from age 12 to age 17, and the original documents all disappeared while in FBI custody. In 1996, I sent Palmer McBride 2 photographs of Marguerite Oswald. One photograph was of the short, dumpy, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald Imposter sitting in the living room of the apartment at 126 Exchange in 1954. The second photograph was the tall, nice-looking, well-dressed Marguerite Clavery Oswald in Paul's shoe store in 1957. McBride said the photograph of the woman sitting in the chair was the woman Harvey Oswald introduced him to as his mother in 1957. When I asked Palmer if he recognized the woman in the second photograph, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, Palmer said he did not recognize her. On the evening of October 27, 1957, Lee Oswald was in his Marine Corps barracks in Japan. Lee Oswald. Richard Sear was standing about 15 yards from the barracks and heard a noise from within the building that sounded like a gunshot. Sear and other Marines ran into the building and found Lee Oswald sitting on his locker with a nickel-plated Derringer laying nearby on the floor. Sear remembered that Lee Oswald said with little emotion, quote, "It seems as though I've shot myself." Sear remembered that Russell Burton, another Marine, ran into the building when he heard the shot. Lee Oswald's close friend, George Wilkins, was nearby. When Wilkins heard a loud noise, he also rushed into Lee Oswald's cubicle. Lee Oswald was sitting on the lower floor of a bunk that he shared with Robert Ogg, and he saw a trace of blood on Lee Oswald's left arm. The wound did not appear to be serious, and Wilkins left the cubicle as other Marines rushed in. Remember, This is a Quonset hut with 72 people. Paul Edward Murphy heard the gunshot from an adjoining cubicle and rushed in to find Lee Oswald sitting on a footlocker looking at a wound in his left forearm. Murphy remembered that Lee Oswald said very calmly, quote, "I believe I have shot myself," end quote. Jerry Pitts remembered that Lee Oswald said he dropped the Derringer in his cubicle and the weapon discharged. When Robert Ogg returned to the barracks, he found a medical corpsman treating Lee Oswald's wound. Lee Oswald was taken to the sickbay for treatment and never again saw Robert Ogg. When Sidney Robinson returned to the barracks, he learned from fellow Marines that Lee Oswald had shot himself in the arm with a .22 caliber pistol. Not one of the Marines who heard the gunshot or saw the wound in Lee Oswald's left arm were questioned by the Warren Commission. Lee Oswald was taken to the Atsugi Station Hospital and then to the U.S. Navy Hospital in nearby Yokosuka. A naval surgeon closed the wound and allowed the slug, which lay just below the surface on the backside of Lee Oswald's upper left arm, to remain in his arm. His injury was diagnosed as, quote, wound, missile, upper left arm gunshot. Patient dropped .45 caliber automatic, pistol discharged when it struck the floor, and missile struck patient in left arm, causing injury. The medical report, signed by Dr. Guthrie, stated that Oswald accidentally shot himself when he dropped a .45 caliber automatic pistol and it discharged. Lee Oswald may have told the physicians that he accidentally shot himself with a .45 caliber Marine-issued weapon, rather than admit that he accidentally shot himself with an unauthorized .22 caliber Derringer, an unauthorized weapon for which Lee Oswald would be court-martialed. A week later, on November 4, 1957, Dr. Greenlease made an incision on the backside of Lee Oswald's arm, removed a .22 caliber slug, and closed 2 wounds with stitches that were removed 10 days later. The physician's narrative summary of the shooting reads, quote, "This 18-year-old male accidentally shot himself in the left arm with a side arm, reportedly of .22 caliber. Examination revealed the wound of entrance in the medial portion of the upper left arm, just above the elbow. There was no evidence of neurological, circulatory, or bone damage. The wound of entrance was allowed to heal, and the missile was then excised through a separate incision 2 inches above the wound of entry. The missile appeared to be a .22 slug. The wound healed well, and the patient was discharged on to duty. Curiously, Lee Oswald's blood type is not shown on any of his Marine Corps medical records in Japan. While Lee Oswald's blood type remains unknown, HARVEY Oswald's blood type was A negative. The shooting resulted in 2 scars, an entrance wound and an incision to remove the .22 bullet from Lee Oswald's left arm above his elbow. On November 24, 1963, when Harvey was killed by Jack Ruby, an autopsy was performed by Dr. Earl Rose of Dallas. In Dr. Rose's lengthy and precise autopsy report, he did not observe, nor did he record, any scars on Harvey Oswald's left arm. After the autopsy, Harvey was taken to the funeral home where he was embalmed by mortician Paul Grudy. Grudy was asked by the Secret Service on several occasions if there were scars on Harvey Oswald's arms, and Grudy repeatedly said there were no scars on Harvey Oswald's upper left arm. Question: Was it FBI Director Hoover's decision or direction that Secret Service agent asked Grudy about scars on Oswald's left arm? Someone asked Grudy to check. Both Dr. Earl Rose and mortician Paul Grudy were correct. There were no scars on HARVEY Oswald's upper left arm. HARVEY Oswald never suffered a .22 caliber gunshot wound to his upper left arm in Japan and had no scars. It was Lee Oswald who was shot and had 2 scars in his upper left arm. In late 1957, as a result of the shooting, Lee Oswald was put on mess duty and charged with violation of Article 92, Military Code of Justice, for failure to register a personal weapon. Proceedings against Lee Oswald were delayed, however, when his unit was sent on maneuvers. Sidney Robinson was corporal of the guard in Atsugi and recalled that Lee Oswald assisted with temporary guard duty under his supervision at Atsugi and aboard the USS Terrell County, which sailed to the north end of the Philippine archipelago on November 20th, 1957. Robinson remembered that on several occasions he had to admonish Lee Oswald for sitting down and reading books. Here again, we are reminded that Lee Oswald is constantly reading books. Lee Oswald's unit arrived in Subi Point, Philippines on November 27, 1957, and then rendezvoused with some 30 other ships of the 7th Fleet. For the next 30 days, and during the Christmas holidays of 1957, the fleet remained at sea. In the fall of 1957, the short, heavyset Marguerite Oswald Imposter and HARVEY Oswald were living at the Hotel Senator in New Orleans. HARVEY Oswald was working as a delivery boy across the street from the hotel at the Pfisterer Dental Lab. At the same time, Christmas 1957, the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Clavery Oswald quit Clyde Campbell's men's store and began working for Welcome Wagon, a national organization that welcomed people to Fort Worth. She then began working at Paul's Shoe Store at 606 Houston in downtown Fort Worth. When in Fort Worth, I, myself, met with Gene Watson at his home. Now, Gene was an employee who worked at Paul's Shoe Store with Marguerite Clavery Oswald. Mr. Watson remembered Marguerite well and told me that while working at Paul's Shoe Store, Marguerite Clavery Oswald also worked as a sales representative for Avon products. Marguerite visited their home and sold Avon products to Mr. Watson's wife. During the Christmas holidays of 1957, Marguerite Clavery Oswald was photographed with store employees June Claybrook, Joe Spence, Gene Watson, store manager James Huff, Claude Dillard, Betty Rich, and Gail Hollis. Mr. Watson showed me this photograph and allowed me to reproduce the photograph, and then I returned it to him. This is the photograph that I sent or showed to Georgia Bell, Maury Goodman, Rita Pavier, who worked at Dolly Shoe, Louis Marzali, who worked at Dolly Shoe, and Palmer McBride, who worked at Pfister's. All of these people said this was not the short, heavyset Marguerite Oswald they knew. One of the most notable features that distinguishes Marguerite Clavery Oswald from the Marguerite Oswald Imposter is their eyebrows. The eyebrows of the Marguerite Oswald Imposter, photographed on the left, are angled sharply downward at a 45-degree angle. The eyebrows of Marguerite Clavery Oswald, on the right photo, are nearly horizontal. Another photo of Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Marguerite Oswald Imposter smiling shows their upper front teeth, which are very different, as you can see. In December 1957, John Pick was stationed at Mitchell Air Force Base, 30 miles east of New York City. Pick and his family were living in a 3-bedroom apartment on Long Island. Pick's mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, visited over the Christmas holidays and stayed at their apartment until January 10, 1958. John Pick's mother-in-law, Mrs. Mary Furman, met Marguerite Claverie Oswald while dropping off Christmas presents for Pick's children. While Marguerite Claverie Oswald was in New York, Lee Oswald spent the Christmas holidays aboard the USS Terrell County in the South China Sea.